Nobody could have predicted that $50 would unravel decades of buried secrets and change 3 broken lives forever. The summer heat pressed down on Millfield County like a heavy blanket, turning the auction yard into a furnace of dust and desperation. Cowboys lined the steel rails, boots planted in the cracked earth, faces shaded beneath wide-brimmed hats that had seen too many seasons of disappointment. The auctioneer's voice rang out like a hammer against anvil, echoing through the dry air with mechanical precision. Inside the holding pen, a buckskin mare stood alone, ribs visible through a coat that had forgotten what kindness looked like. The placard above her stall read Lot 163, starting bid $50. Most folks had already dismissed her, their attention focused elsewhere on animals that promised profit rather than heartache. Samuel Hartwell stood apart from the crowd, arms crossed over his chest, 67 years of hard living etched into every weathered line of his face. His gray beard was trimmed but tired, much like the man who wore it. Since losing Margaret the previous autumn, he had barely spoken to anyone beyond what necessity demanded. The ranch had grown quiet, empty, filled only with echoes of what used to be laughter, conversation, the sound of a life shared. This morning, he had come to the auction out of habit, or perhaps out of hope. He could not say which drove him more: the familiar rhythm of hooves on dirt, the smell of hay and sweat, the voices of men who understood that sometimes a man needed to be around living things that did not ask questions or offer condolences that felt like sandpaper against raw wounds. When the gate creaked open and the mare limped into the ring, favoring her left front leg, a few ranchers chuckled softly. One man in a faded denim shirt muttered that she looked more ghost than horse. The auctioneer barely tried to drum up enthusiasm, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who knew when he was selling damaged goods. "Do I hear $50? He called without conviction. The silence stretched like a held breath. Heads shook in quiet dismissal, eyes already turning toward the next lot. Then, without warning or conscious thought, Samuel raised his weathered hand. The gesture felt foreign, like his body had made a decision his mind had not yet caught up to. "50, he said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a stone dropped into still water. The auctioneer blinked in genuine surprise. "We have $50. Anyone else?" No one moved. The gavel fell with finality that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. "Sold to the gentleman in the gray hat." There were knowing smirks, a few whispered comments about old men and their foolish choices, but Samuel did not care. Something had shifted in his chest, something he had not felt since Margaret's funeral. He approached the rail and accepted the lead rope with steady hands. And when the mare's eyes met his, one deep amber, the other clouded with old pain, something passed between them that neither could name, but both understood completely. Sometimes the most profound changes happen in the spaces between words, in the quiet territories where trust grows without announcement or fanfare. Samuel loaded the mare, whom he decided to call Luna, into his weathered trailer and began the long drive home, through rolling hills that stretched endlessly under an infinite sky. No radio played, no conversation filled the cab, just the steady rhythm of tires on cracked asphalt and the weight of decisions that felt both inevitable and mysterious. The silence was comfortable in its own way, like an old coat worn thin, but still capable of warmth. Behind him, Luna rode quietly, perhaps understanding that this journey was different from others she had endured. The trailer swayed gently as they navigated curves that Samuel had traveled for 40 years, each bend as familiar as his own heartbeat. When they arrived at the ranch, Samuel made a choice that surprised even him. He did not lead Luna to the main barn with its spacious stalls and modern conveniences. Instead, he opened the gate to the small paddock behind the house, the one beneath the spreading oak tree where his grandson Tommy used to play during summer visits that now seemed like memories borrowed from someone else's life. The tree's branches cast shifting shadows across grass that had grown tall with neglect, creating patterns of light and darkness that moved like living things. Samuel unclipped the lead rope with careful deliberation, set out fresh hay that smelled of summer meadows, and filled a galvanized trough with clean water that caught the late afternoon sun like liquid silver. Then he walked away without ceremony, without expectations, understanding instinctively that sometimes the kindest gift was simply space to exist without judgment or demand. That evening, Samuel sat on his front porch with coffee that grew cold in his hands, while his attention wandered elsewhere. Out in the paddock, Luna stood motionless under stars that emerged one by one, like shy witnesses to her solitude. She resembled a statue forgotten by time itself, carved from shadow and moonlight. He watched her for a long while, saying nothing, but something stirred in his chest that had been dormant since Margaret's funeral, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The next morning arrived with the soft light that comes before sunrise, painting the hills in gentle gold that made everything look newly possible. Samuel found himself drawn outside before breakfast, pulled by an impulse he could not name. Luna watched his approach with wary amber eyes that held depths of caution earned through hard experience. He moved slowly, deliberately, showing her through his presence, rather than words that healing sometimes began with simply existing in the same space, breathing the same air, sharing the same quiet morning light. Neither spoke, neither demanded, neither promised anything beyond the simple acknowledgement that they were both still here, still breathing, still capable of tomorrow. In the growing light, Samuel understood that this was not about fixing what was broken, but about creating space where broken things could learn to trust again. Some visitors arrive, bearing more than bread and neighborly concern. They come carrying mirrors that reflect truths we have spent months avoiding. 3 days into their quiet coexistence, Samuel received an unexpected arrival that would shift the delicate balance he had constructed around silence and solitude. Clara Bennett appeared at his door with fresh-baked bread, still warm from her oven, and that trademark directness that had made her both beloved and feared in equal measure throughout Millfield County. She commented without preamble that she had heard he bought himself a project at the auction, her eyes already scanning past him toward the paddock where Luna stood in the morning shade. Samuel did not respond immediately, never one for quick words or easy explanations. The silence stretched between them like a familiar dance they had performed countless times over the decades of shared fence lines and mutual respect. Eventually, he muttered that Luna still had some fight left in her, his voice carrying the weight of conviction mixed with uncertainty. Clara studied him with knowing eyes that had witnessed too many broken things to be fooled by surface appearances. She asked, what about him? Did he have any fight left? And the question hung heavy between them like morning mist that refuses to burn off even under direct sunlight. After she left, taking her penetrating observations and half-eaten bread with her, Samuel found himself drawn toward the paddock with new purpose. That afternoon, he approached Luna, carrying a soft brush, worn smooth by years of use, its bristles gentle enough for the most delicate work. Luna did not run. She did not welcome him either. But she stayed, her amber eyes tracking his every movement with the careful attention of something that had learned to measure threat in increments too small for most to notice. He began working away layers of dirt and neglect that had accumulated like sediment over time, each stroke revealing more of what lay beneath. Up close, Samuel could see old scars mapping her hide like a topography of pain. Some had healed clean and white. Others remained raised and angry, testament to wounds that had never quite found peace. He recognized the pain this animal carried as uncomfortably familiar, the way broken things always recognize their own kind across species and circumstance. The work was meditative, rhythmic, requiring nothing more than patience and the willingness to exist in proximity to suffering without trying to fix everything at once. Luna's breathing gradually slowed, her muscles relaxing incrementally as trust built itself one careful brushstroke at a time. That night, something shifted in the careful architecture of their relationship. Luna finally lay down in the grass beneath the spreading oak, her body forming a dark curve against the silver-touched earth. From his porch, Samuel understood with absolute certainty that this meant she no longer expected to be hurt when darkness fell. The realization hit him with unexpected force, not just about Luna, but about the possibility that healing might be contagious, that perhaps broken things could teach each other how to trust the morning light again. Sometimes the most profound discoveries arrive disguised as ordinary moments, revealing themselves only when multiple broken souls converge in the same space, each carrying pieces of a puzzle none of them knew they were solving. By the fourth day, Samuel began noticing changes so small they might have been invisible to anyone not paying careful attention to the language of recovery. Luna would lift her head when she heard his boots on gravel, the sound no longer triggering the reflexive tensing of muscles prepared for flight. She no longer flinched at the metallic click of the gate latch, that sharp sound that once sent ripples of panic across her hide. Most remarkably, she moved toward him with something resembling curiosity when he approached with fresh hay, her steps tentative but deliberate, like someone learning to trust their own impulses again. Samuel had spent his entire life fixing broken fences, patching torn metal, and coaxing life from stubborn machinery. But this kind of repair was different, slower and quieter, starting from some invisible place deep inside and working its way outward like sap rising in spring trees. The work required a patience he was still learning to possess, a willingness to measure progress in heartbeats rather than hammer strikes. That morning, he brought a worn saddle blanket to the paddock fence, not to use but simply to let Luna grow accustomed to its presence. The leather-scented wool hung over the rail like a promise, neither urgent nor demanding, just available when she might be ready to consider its possibilities. While completing other tasks around the ranch, checking fence posts that had stood firm for decades, and adjusting gates that opened and closed with the reliability of sunrise, Samuel discovered an unexpected addition to his quiet world. His grandson Tommy sat beneath the old pecan tree, 12 years old and bearing his mother's delicate features more than his father's angular ones. The boy had been dropped off without much explanation, another broken thing seeking refuge in the space Samuel had unconsciously created for damaged souls. Tommy's presence felt both surprising and inevitable, as if the ranch itself had been calling to those who needed sanctuary from whatever storms had scattered them here. That evening, Samuel prepared grilled cheese and tomato soup using Margaret's recipe, the familiar ritual of cooking, filling the kitchen with smells that carried memories of better times. The simple meal connected past and present through the alchemy of butter, bread, and careful attention. Afterward, without invitation or announcement, Tommy wandered out to the paddock where he stood near Luna, his young voice carrying across the evening air in whispers Samuel could not quite hear. Whatever words the boy offered, Luna did not retreat. She stood listening with the focused attention of someone who understood that important communications often came in frequencies too quiet for most adults to detect. Watching from his porch, Samuel experienced a revelation that arrived with the gentle force of dawn breaking. Perhaps healing was not meant to happen in isolation, but in the careful convergence of wounded souls who could recognize in each other the possibility of tomorrow being different from yesterday. Sometimes the heaviest truths emerge from the mouths of children who have learned to carry burdens that should belong to adults, their innocence stripped away by circumstances that leave them wise beyond their years and tired in ways that sleep cannot cure. The next morning, Samuel found Tommy already outside, leaning against the weathered fence with a half-eaten apple clutched in small fingers, dark circles under his eyes, speaking eloquently of sleepless nights and worries too substantial for shoulders so narrow. Luna stood watching him from across the paddock, with the careful attention that wild things reserve for potential kindred spirits, her amber eyes tracking his smallest movements with an intelligence that suggested she recognized something familiar in his stillness. The morning light caught the silver streaks in her mane, revealing beauty that persisted despite everything that had tried to extinguish it. When Samuel approached quietly, with his morning coffee steaming in the cool air, Tommy asked without preamble if Luna had ever been truly free. The question hung in the space between them like morning mist, weighted with implications that reached far beyond horses and paddocks. Samuel answered that maybe she had been, long ago, before someone decided to break what was whole and wild. The boy nodded with understanding that ran deeper than his 12 years should have allowed, as if freedom and its loss were concepts he had contemplated during those long sleepless hours. Later, while they worked together on the old chicken coop that did not really need repairs, but provided the comfortable fiction of shared purpose, Tommy delivered words that landed like stones dropped into still water. His mother had explained that Samuel and his father maintained their silence because Samuel believed he had been disappointed by his son's choices. Samuel stopped mid-swing, hammer hovering over worn wood, like time itself had paused to consider the weight of spoken truth. Tommy added with devastating simplicity that maybe the real reason was because Samuel had disappointed himself, and the observation cut through decades of carefully constructed justifications with surgical precision. The boy possessed an intuitive understanding of how guilt could calcify into stubborn pride, how shame could masquerade as righteousness until the original wound became impossible to distinguish from the scar tissue that had grown around it. That evening, Clara arrived bearing blankets and a folded note, explaining that she was taking it upon herself to inform Samuel's son that his boy was still breathing since the man refused to answer his telephone. The implication hung unspoken but clear. Some silences were luxuries that children could not afford to subsidize with their sense of security. After Clara departed with her characteristic blend of kindness and pointed observation, Tommy walked out carrying a brush, with the same careful deliberation Samuel had witnessed in his own movements around Luna. The boy waited with infinite patience until the mare allowed him to touch her side, then moved the bristles slowly over fur that had forgotten what gentle hands felt like, working around scars that mapped stories of survival. Neither of them would ever fully know, but both instinctively understood. Some secrets carry weight that can crush a man's sleep for decades, revealing themselves only when the cost of silence becomes heavier than the burden of truth. And sometimes those revelations arrive disguised as yellowed paper in unmarked envelopes that change everything with a single line of ink. The morning came heavy with storm clouds that warned of rain but had not yet committed to the promise, hanging in the sky like unfinished thoughts that cast everything below in shades of uncertainty and anticipation. Samuel stood at his kitchen window, watching as Tommy slipped inside Luna's gate with the newfound ease of someone who had earned trust through consistency rather than force. The horse no longer backed away as she once had. Her posture relaxed in a way that spoke of genuine comfort rather than mere resignation. The boy possessed a gentleness that Samuel had never been skilled at showing, a natural fluidity in his movements that filled the older man with quiet pride, tangled up inextricably with old regret. Walking to the mailbox along the same dirt path he had traveled for 40 years, Samuel discovered a yellowed envelope bearing no return address, but handwriting that struck him with the familiarity of half-remembered nightmares. Inside, a folded piece of paper contained only one line, asking him to inquire with Fletcher Morrison about where that horse had truly come from. The name hit him like gravel thrown against his gut. Fletcher had been managing the auction pens for years, and they had known each other since Samuel was a younger man. Their relationship built on grudging respect and carefully maintained boundaries that had not always held firm under pressure. This revelation transformed everything. Luna was not just any abused horse seeking sanctuary. She was something specific, something dangerous enough that someone wanted her history to remain buried beneath layers of false paperwork and convenient amnesia. The drive into town felt longer than usual. Each mile weighted with the growing certainty that he was approaching a threshold he could not uncross. Samuel found Fletcher smoking behind the auction barn, his weathered face creased with the kind of worry that came from keeping secrets that grew heavier with time. Fletcher's revelation came reluctantly, dragged from him like splinters from infected flesh. Luna had emerged from a seizure outside Junction, part of a scene so horrific that seasoned officers had needed counseling afterward. Blood-stained concrete, chains embedded in flesh, animals starved to the edge of death and beyond. Luna had not been the worst case, but she had come close to joining the ones they could not save. Someone had paid cash under the table to get her cleared for auction, no names attached to any paperwork, and Fletcher had possessed neither the courage nor the authority to ask questions that might have revealed answers he was not prepared to handle. Samuel drove home through thickening clouds, understanding now that he had stumbled into something far more complex than simple animal rescue. Luna carried within her scarred hide the evidence of crimes that stretched beyond individual cruelty into networks of organized suffering, and someone clearly believed that evidence was worth killing to protect. Sometimes, the most dangerous truths hide in plain sight, waiting in forgotten boxes and faded photographs until the moment arrives when silence becomes more perilous than revelation. And what seemed like simple rescue transforms into something that threatens to unravel carefully buried secrets spanning decades. By the time Samuel returned to the ranch, the wind had picked up with the restless energy that precedes serious weather, and the sky had turned that heavy greenish gray that warned of storms carrying more than rain. Clara stood on the porch with arms crossed, having watched over Tommy with the protective vigilance of someone who understood that children needed anchoring when adults disappeared into their own dangerous thoughts. Samuel was too lost in the implications of Fletcher's revelations to argue about babysitting arrangements, his mind churning through possibilities he wished he could dismiss as paranoia. He did not tell Clara what he had learned, could not yet find words to explain that Luna represented something far more complex than animal rescue. She was a living witness, a breathing repository of evidence that someone had worked very hard to erase from official records and public memory. That evening, as thunder rolled across the hills like distant artillery, Samuel found himself unable to settle into his usual routines. Instead, he spent hours searching through old boxes in the shed, looking for something he could not name but would recognize when found. His hands moved through yellowed veterinary records and forgotten paperwork, with the methodical persistence of someone following invisible threads toward inevitable revelation. In one dust-covered box, beneath layers of administrative debris from decades past, he discovered a photograph that stopped his breath entirely. The image showed his son David at a younger age, standing proudly next to Samuel and a mare whose bone structure and coloring bore an unmistakable resemblance to Luna. The connection hit him with the force of puzzle pieces sliding into place, creating a picture he had never wanted to see completed. The next day, when the local veterinarian examined Luna with careful attention to bloodline characteristics, she confirmed what Samuel had begun to suspect. The mare's conformation and markings suggested specific breeding, though without documentation it remained educated speculation rather than legal certainty. That evening, Tommy discovered something that transformed speculation into immediate danger. Nailed to the barn door with crude urgency, a rain-soaked note bore handwriting so sloppy it was barely legible. The message was brief but unmistakable: return the horse or face consequences that would extend far beyond property damage. Samuel read the words with growing certainty that they were being watched, that someone still believed Luna belonged to them, and was prepared to take extreme measures to reclaim what they considered stolen property. Looking toward the paddock where Luna stood calm and quiet beside Tommy, her coat gleaming with health that spoke of careful tending and genuine affection, Samuel understood that some battles chose you rather than the other way around. The storm was coming, and it would bring more than wind and rain. It would bring a reckoning that had been postponed too long, demanding payment in courage he was not sure he still possessed. Darkness has a way of delivering what daylight has long avoided, carrying with it the weight of unfinished business and the bitter taste of reckonings postponed too long by pride and silence. The next morning brought an unnatural quiet to the ranch that made Samuel's skin crawl with premonition. No birds calling from the oak tree, no wind stirring the grass, not even the distant rumble of trucks from the county road that usually provided the ranch's soundtrack. Samuel stepped onto the porch with his morning coffee and immediately noticed something wrong in the way the world held itself too still. The barn padlock had been cut clean through, not picked or forced, but severed with the kind of precision that spoke of purpose and complete absence of fear. Someone had walked onto his property in the dead of night, with tools and intentions that left no room for accident or misunderstanding. Inside the barn, nothing had been stolen, but the violation was unmistakable. Straw scattered in patterns that told stories of hurried movement, tools knocked askew from their careful arrangements, the lingering smell of strangers who had no business breathing his air or touching his things. Worst of all, Luna bore fresh cuts on her flank, shallow wounds that had been inflicted with surgical precision, deep enough to bleed but not enough to kill, sufficient only to send a message written in pain and fear. Tommy found her first, his young voice cracking with panic as he called for Samuel, who knelt beside the mare and muttered curses about cowards under his breath. while his hands moved with gentle efficiency over her wounds. The cuts were clean, deliberate, the work of someone who understood exactly how much pain to inflict without crossing the line into permanent damage. Instead of calling the sheriff, Samuel reached out to Buck Graves, a retired lawman who had spent decades untangling the kinds of crimes that thrived in rural shadows. Buck arrived within the hour, his weathered face grim as he examined the evidence with the methodical attention of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by human cruelty. The confirmation came with devastating clarity. This connected to something much larger than simple animal abuse, part of a network involving illegal breeding operations and dirty money that stretched across county lines and had never been fully unraveled despite years of investigation. That night, Tommy made a decision that broke Samuel's heart with its fierce loyalty. The boy refused to sleep in the house, dragging his sleeping bag to the barn and positioning himself beside Luna with the quiet defiance of someone who understood that protection sometimes required presence more than strength. Sometime after midnight, as Samuel sat on his porch with his revolver across his lap and his eyes scanning shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose, headlights appeared at the far end of the property like distant stars falling toward Earth. When the truck door opened and a tall figure stepped into the darkness, Samuel recognized immediately the walk and stance he had carried in his memory for years of stubborn silence. David had returned, drawn home by Clara's message that his father had bought a horse that did not forget pain, perhaps understanding that some wounds could only heal when the people who shared them stopped running from each other. Truth has a way of arriving precisely when we are least prepared to receive it, carrying with it the full weight of years spent avoiding what needed to be faced, demanding payment in vulnerability that feels like standing naked in winter wind. The silence between father and son stretched thick and unfinished, like a wound left to rot instead of heal, filled with all the words that had been swallowed over decades of stubborn pride and mutual disappointment. David stepped onto the porch as the moment arrived. Whether Samuel liked it or not, his boots heavy against wood that had supported too many difficult conversations postponed until tomorrow. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he handed over the faded photograph he had discovered buried beneath years of deliberate forgetting. The image showing young David standing proudly beside a mare named Star, whose bloodlines ran through Luna's veins like a river connecting past to present. David studied the picture with a jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, recognizing immediately that Luna represented more than simple rescue. She was living proof of theft, committed during the ranch's struggling years, stolen through backdoor deals Samuel had never fully explained and certainly never confessed. Anger flashed across David's weathered features before fading into something deeper and more dangerous. The kind of hurt that comes from understanding your father had carried secrets that belonged to you both. Their confrontation shattered like glass against the sharp crack of splintering wood from the back fence, where darkness had finally come calling with crowbars and ropes and intentions that left no room for misunderstanding. Both men moved with the fluid coordination of shared DNA, grabbing weapons and running toward sounds that promised violence against everything they had spent weeks learning to protect. Luna charged at her attackers with the fury of something that had endured enough, her hooves striking earth like thunder, while David tackled one intruder and Samuel fired a warning shot that split the night air like lightning. Clara's voice rang from the porch, announcing that law enforcement was already en route, and the would-be thieves melted back into darkness like shadows fleeing dawn. Buck Graves arrived to confirm what they had suspected, that their evidence had helped unravel an illegal breeding ring spanning 3 counties, turning Luna from victim into catalyst for justice that had been years in the making. The next morning came quiet, like the land itself was catching its breath after holding it too long. Samuel poured coffee for both himself and David, the simple ritual of shared caffeine bridging gaps that words had failed to cross. Tommy sat cross-legged in the dirt beside Luna, sketching something in a notebook, while the mare stood peacefully in sunlight that caught the red highlights in her coat, like promises kept. Clara arrived bearing an old halter that had belonged to Star, cracked leather that smelled of memory and possibility. That afternoon they gathered by the paddock, as Tommy placed it around Luna's neck with ceremony that felt both ancient and newly born. The horse leaned into the boy like she had been waiting her entire life for this moment of recognition, this acknowledgement that she was finally home. Thank you for watching this story of healing and second chances. If you enjoyed seeing how broken things can find their way back to wholeness, please like and subscribe for more videos like this. I'll see you in the next video.